When Strawberry Shortcake first came out in 1980, she and her friends were incredibly popular. Where we lived, it wasn't easy to find them in the beginning. While perhaps not as difficult to track down as Star Wars figures had been their first year, Strawberry Shortcake toys were elusive, especially Strawberry Shortcake and Huckleberry Pie. Her friends Blueberry Muffin and Apple Dumpling seemed to show up on store shelves and last long enough to be purchased. But neither of those were the ones I wanted to be my first Strawberry Shortcake doll. I wanted Strawberry Shortcake. After all, she was the one every cool girl in school had. My dad graduated college in 1980, and after a year of not being able to find a job in his degree field, we ended up having to move somewhere my dad could find a job. This meant moving away from my dad's family and the school and friends I'd always known, in a neighborhood whose streets I'd run from sunrise to sunset as one of those stereotypical free-range Gen X kids whose parents mostly left us alone so long as we were home by dark. This was just before faces on milk cartons and school assemblies about stranger danger. Moving just sucked. Even though I was only in first grade, I'd already felt established in my friend group. And while I wasn't one of the popular it girls who roamed the playgrounds with their Strawberry Shortcake dolls, I did get to hang out with the cool, nerdy Star Wars kids. I definitely was not friends, though, with sucky, stuck-up Zachary, who always had everything and made sure we knew how much money his family had. And the one silver lining to having to move and change schools was that there would be no more sucky Zachary and his stupid, bloated toy collection. As long as I could remember, our family always had our own house, but things were tight financially with my dad's long, unsuccessful job search. Stage 1 of the move required me and my mom and my baby brother to stay with my mom's parents while my dad started work in the oil fields. He'd be gone long hours offshore for days on end, busy working to come up with the first and last month deposit plus utility hookups. Living with my grandparents was necessary to our survival, but it only piled more tension on top of everything. Part of the tensions were over our family dog, a Great Dane I'd named Marmaduke. I wasn't a very creative first grader. My original suggestions were Yoda and Lobot, and those were instantly vetoed. My mom briefly considered Pupcake after Strawberry Shortcake's friend Huckleberry Pie's dog, but eventually deciding against it, feeling like it wasn't appropriate for a Great Dane. So we settled on Marmaduke of newspaper comic strip fame. We quickly nicknamed him Duke. If you're unaware, Great Danes are giants. It took a lot of persuasion, at least one threat of punishment, and bribery with Star Wars figures to convince me the Duke was not, in fact, a mini horse I could ride. I wasn't entirely sold on this, but getting a Bespin Guard and Bosk helped convince me otherwise, at least temporarily. My grandparents had a decently sized house with a big yard and an extra room due to my uncles recently deciding to move out on their own. It was barely large enough to fit my parents, myself, and the crib my baby brother slept in. However, there was definitely not enough room for Duke to live in the bedroom with us. He had to live outside, in the backyard. And because my grandparents had 2 ancient dogs, a bulldog, and a cocker spaniel, Duke didn't get to freely roam the backyard. He had to remain chained so that my grandparents' dogs could stick in their corner of the yard. This, of course, added stress. Duke was used to having a big, giant yard with a fence tall enough to keep him in check, leaving him free to roam about as he pleased. So he barked, and he howled, and my grandparents' dogs barked and howled back. Sometimes they angrily barked at each other. It was a horrible sound, and the neighbors hated it and complained to my grandparents, constantly. No matter how much attention we gave Duke, no matter how many walks we took him on those first weeks, it wasn't enough to keep him from howling once he was chained. It didn't matter how many times we tried to soothe him, assuring him that it was only for 3 months. I mean, that felt like forever to me. I can't imagine how long it felt to Duke. Duke was not alone in having problems adjusting. I was having problems adjusting. A new school was at the top of the list of my woes. I'd had a lot of friends at my old school and a neighborhood full of kids my age to play with. I knew no one here. My grandparents lived in a neighborhood of older parents in their 30s and 40s, where the kids were at best teenagers or in their early 20s. And at school, everyone was immediately suspicious of me being the new kid. It almost made me miss Zachary. And remember, he was the worst. Stuck-up, spoiled, snotty Zachary. Suck it, Zachary, wherever you are. There was, however, a group of girls I really wanted to be friends with, and all of them had Strawberry Shortcake dolls. The queen bee naturally had Strawberry Shortcake. Her best friend had Blueberry Muffin, another had Apple Dumpling, and yet another had Raspberry Tart, who had just started showing up on store shelves. Just none of the shelves I'd seen. Me and another girl, let's call her Christine, became sort of friends with each other as we both tried to get those girls to let us hang out with them. But these girls made it clear, to hang out with them, you had to have Strawberry Shortcake dolls. We started calling those girls the Strawberries. Everybody in our first grade class did. Adding to the complexity were two harsh facts. One, not only could my mother not find any of the Strawberry Shortcake dolls in stores, but two, they were expensive. Keep in mind, when first released, Strawberry Shortcake and her friends were between $6.99 to $8.99, depending on the store. That was quite a bit of money for the time. According to several inflation calculators, that puts a single Strawberry Shortcake doll into the $25 to $35 realm in 2024 money. While we were only going to live at my grandparents' house for 3 months, it didn't take more than 3 to 4 weeks for the tensions to begin really mounting. There just wasn't a lot of space for all of these people, one of whom was barely a year old and dealing with colic, plus the dogs, all 3 of them. The older ones may have been smaller and inside most of the time, but it's still 3 dogs. Mix into this the regular guest star spots of 2 different uncles, both of whom were nuisances. It may sound like an 80s sitcom, but it wasn't. Both of my uncles were young and irresponsible. They'd move home anytime they didn't have enough money for rent or food, or had gotten fired from another dead-end job, or their vehicle broke down and they didn't have money to fix it. And once back home, they found us crammed into the bedroom that had once been theirs. And one of them would be stuck on the living room couch and one on the floor in my grandmother's doll room. And having anyone in my grandmother's doll room was a lot of drama. My grandmother's doll room was where she went to find her inner peace. But it was the inner peace of the late 1970s, early 1980s that really just meant no one had figured out my grandmother was bipolar and knew how to deal with her other than letting her go into the doll room and have her space. That doll room was necessary for everyone's survival in the house. Bipolar rages are not fun, especially when you don't know what they are. My grandmother was a collector, and her doll room was always filled with things, with more things added regularly. Daily, really. She's the big reason I'm a collector. My earliest collector impulses were fueled by her and my mother's collector mentality and shopaholic habits were inherited from my grandmother. My grandmother had spoons from all the states, and ceramic glassware, and thimbles, and fancy china dishes, and lamps and dishes made of carnival glass. But most importantly, she collected Franklin Mint dolls, as well as any porcelain doll that she thought was cute or pretty. She also spoiled me. Many of my early Star Wars figures came from her. And in the summer of 1980, when I'd spent a few weeks with them, she'd gotten me an extra Bespin Leia, and my first Hoth Han, Bespin Luke, and FX7. All from Woolworth's, Ben Franklin's, or the other locally owned discount department store whose name I cannot remember to this day, although it's long closed, due to Walmart. Frankly, that's a fate shared by all of my favorite regional and locally owned discount stores of my youth. We were roughly 3 weeks into this new living arrangement when one day our Great Dane Duke broke his chain, hopped the fence, and managed to gallop down several residential streets until he come out on a highway and managed to throw himself directly in front of an 18-wheeler that had no time to stop. And that's what I came home to from school that day. And it was devastating. My heart shattered. But this was the early 1980s, and my dad was away for the week at work, and my grandfather had only recently retired from a job as a drill sergeant, and he was adamant that I needed to go to school the next day. There was no time for crying over a dead dog, especially one he'd had to bury in the backyard in a spot he'd planned on planting his tomato plants in. To make things worse, the next day at school, Christine had finally gotten a Strawberry Shortcake doll and spent all morning gloating that she was finally going to be one of the strawberries, and that since I didn't have a Strawberry Shortcake doll yet, I was going to have no friends. And she was such a lovely person that she added if my parents loved me, they would have also gotten me a Strawberry Shortcake doll, so I could be a strawberry like she would be. And I will say that at recess, when Christine proudly marched over to them and demanded her admittance to the strawberries, I was in no small measure pleased to see them laugh at her, reject her, and tell her, "We already have a Strawberry Shortcake in the group. We don't need another one." She cried and stormed off, and I didn't see her for the rest of the day, which was fine because I was still mad at her for being such a shitty person to me. And she had a Strawberry Shortcake doll. Christine had just become the new Zachary in my life. It did make me realize I wanted the toy more than I wanted to be a strawberry, though. Especially now that I knew the strawberries were snotty little bitches. Also, Christine had a Strawberry Shortcake, and they didn't want her. What chance did I have? I sat by myself at lunch, as well as at last recess, just trying not to cry about Duke. Because as if not having any friends weren't dreadful enough, getting teased about crying at school would make it much worse. When I got home from school that day, my grandmother was quite excited. My mother was too, but she came across hesitant and reserved in her excitement. My grandmother led me into the kitchen, and there on the table was a boxed Strawberry Shortcake doll. She'd found one at the local Ben Franklin's department store. I was so excited, but my mom quickly interjected, they only had the boy. But he's cute, and he has red hair, like Strawberry Shortcake. And like us, my grandmother added. Another thing my grandmother and I shared was our red hair. It had skipped my mom, leaving her with blonde hair that sometimes had enough of a red tint that she referred to herself as a strawberry blonde. But my grandmother and I had bold red hair. My grandmother's hair was the exact shade of Strawberry Shortcake's, and mine was closer to the darker red of Strawberry Shortcake's friend, Huckleberry Pie. I loved him, instantly, and he smelled wonderful. I didn't care that he wasn't Strawberry Shortcake, although I did really still want her. I just had one of them now. And the box had pictures of all of them, so I kind of had them. And he smelled like huckleberries. I didn't even know what a huckleberry was, so I got to learn about huckleberries that day as my grandmother described how her favorite pie as a kid had been Huckleberry Pie. We went to the doll room and I played with Huckleberry Pie, and my grandmother sat on her chaise lounge and relaxed there where she was happiest, with all of her dolls and spoons and thimbles all around her. And for the evening she was at peace, as was I, distracted from what had happened with Duke and what had happened at school. The next day at school, Christine immediately made fun of me. "You have the boy? Gross." But at recess, the strawberries invited me to play with them. None of them had Huckleberry Pie. I didn't actually want to play with them, though. After all, they were snotty little bitches. But it really pissed Christine off that they didn't give a shit about her Strawberry Shortcake doll, but it adored mine. What was it she said? Oh yeah, I had the boy. Gross. I hoped that she and Zachary would get married one day, because they were both the worst. To this day, my love of everything Strawberry Shortcake remains. But I will always love Huckleberry Pie just a little bit more, because I will always have that afternoon playing in the doll room with him while my grandmother and I found our peace, our bond being strengthened for all time that day. A bright spot in a very rough strawberry patch.